A millionaire woman joked while asking a poor single-dad mechanic for advice, but his answer left her pale. She walked in like she owned the place, and everyone in it. One careless joke. One quiet man. One answer that changed everything. But no one imagined what would come next. If this story already has you hooked, drop a like and let us know in the comments. Your support means the world and helps us bring more stories like this one to life. The morning air in Nashville smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee, and Daniel Mercer wouldn't have had it any other way. He had opened Mercer's auto at 6:30 sharp, the way he did every single weekday, sliding up the heavy iron door of the garage bay before the sun had fully cleared the tree line on Gallatin Pike. The fluorescent lights flickered once, then held. The radio on the shelf above the workbench crackled to life with a country song he half knew, and he hummed along without thinking about it, already pulling on his work gloves. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning where the cold hadn't quite decided how serious it was going to be. Daniel was 38 years old, lean in the way that comes not from a gym but from years of physical work, with dark hair gone slightly silver at the temples and hands that told the whole story of his life if you knew how to read them. He had a calm face, the kind people sometimes mistook for blankness until he looked directly at you, and then you understood it was something else entirely, something settled, something earned. By 7:15, his first two appointments had already come and gone, an oil change on a 2019 Ford F-150 belonging to Ray Tillman, who always tipped $5 and asked about Sophie, and a brake inspection on a minivan driven by a woman named Carol, who had 3 car seats in the back and apologized twice for the Cheerios on the floor. Daniel told her it was no trouble both times and meant it. Sophie. He thought about her the way he always did between tasks, in small, vivid flashes. This morning she had woken up at 6 and padded into the kitchen in her socks, her dark hair wild from sleep, carrying the stuffed rabbit she'd named Gerald. She was 8 years old and had recently decided that Gerald needed glasses, so she had bent the wire from a twist tie into 2 tiny circles and taped them to the rabbit's face. Daniel had looked at Gerald's new glasses over his coffee cup and told her they were very distinguished. Sophie had nodded seriously and said she knew. He had dropped her at Riverside Elementary at 7:50, watched her run toward the front doors without looking back the way kids do when they're happy and comfortable, and don't yet understand that their parents stand watching until they disappear. He had stood there an extra few seconds anyway. He always did. The Porsche arrived at 9:12. Daniel heard it before he saw it, the low, precise growl of a well-engineered engine pulling into the gravel lot. He stepped out from under the hood of a Chevy Tahoe he'd been working on and watched the car park. It was a silver Cayenne, current year, immaculate except for what was apparently a persistent grinding sound in the front left wheel well, which was what the appointment was for. The appointment had been made by an assistant, which Daniel only knew because the assistant had called and given her name as Jess and said the car belonged to Ms. Victoria Hale and that Ms. Hale would need it back by noon if at all possible. Victoria Hale stepped out of the car, and Daniel saw immediately that she was someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room she entered. She was around 30, slender, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, with dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless and almost certainly wasn't. She wore heels in a parking lot full of gravel and oil stains without a flicker of hesitation. She looked at the garage the way people look at things they consider unfortunate necessities. "You're the mechanic?" she said. Not rudely exactly, just with that particular economy of language that wealthy people sometimes use when they have decided in advance that a conversation will be brief. "Daniel Mercer," he said, pulling off one glove to offer his hand. She looked at the hand for just a moment, not long enough to be a scene, but long enough, and then shook it once quickly. "Victoria Hale, my assistant called about the Cayenne." "She did. Grinding in the front left," she said. "It started about a week ago. I kept meaning to have someone look at it." She said someone the way she might have said anyone, which is to say with a kind of vagueness that made the distinction feel irrelevant. "I'll take a look," Daniel said. "Should be able to tell you what we're dealing with inside of 20 minutes. Victoria nodded, already looking at her phone. She walked toward the small waiting area Daniel had set up inside. 2 chairs, a side table, a lamp, a coffee maker that actually worked. He heard her pause when she saw it, and something about that pause made him think she had expected worse and wasn't quite sure what to do with the discrepancy. He got to work. The grinding was the front left wheel bearing, which he'd suspected from the description. It was worn down enough to be a genuine safety issue, not an emergency, but not something to put off either. He documented everything before going back inside to let her know. Victoria Hale was standing near the window, phone to her ear, speaking in the clipped and efficient way of someone who manages large things. She held up one finger without looking at him, which he accepted without comment. He waited. She finished the call, turned and looked at him with the polite and faintly impatient expression of someone expecting a number. He gave her the diagnosis and the estimate. She listened, nodded, approved it without negotiating, which he noted. Whatever else she wasn't cheap about the things she deemed worth paying for. "How long?" she asked. 90 minutes, give or take." She exhaled slightly and looked around the waiting area. Then she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, he thought. And something shifted in her expression. It wasn't malice, not exactly. It was the specific kind of thoughtlessness that masquerades as humor in people who have never had to be careful with their words. "You know," she said, "I always wonder about men who end up doing this. Don't you ever think—" She gestured vaguely at the garage, at the grease on his forearms, at the general fact of the place, "that you could have done something more with your life?" The words landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change. Not a flicker of hurt, not a flash of anger. Just that same settled calm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and entirely without performance. "Every morning," he said, "I wake up at 5:50. I make breakfast for my daughter. She's 8. Her name is Sophie. I walk her to the bus stop when it's warm and drive her to school when it's cold. I know every kid in her class by name. I know which ones are kind to her and which ones aren't. I come here and I do work that people need done, and I do it honestly and I do it well. I go home in the evening and I help with homework and I read out loud and I make sure she knows, every single night, that she is the most important thing in any world I will ever live in." He paused just for a beat. "I haven't missed a single day of that in 8 years. Not one." He held her gaze for one more moment. "But I appreciate your concern." He turned and walked back into the garage. Victoria Hale stood very still in the waiting area for a long time after that. Long enough that when Daniel glanced in through the window from under the Cayenne, she was still there, not on her phone, not moving, just standing. An expression on her face he couldn't quite name from that distance. He got back to work. She didn't say anything else until the car was finished and the invoice was settled. And when she left without the briskness she'd arrived with. She walked to the Cayenne more slowly, got in more carefully, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Daniel watched through the window. He didn't know what she was thinking. He didn't need to. He had said what was true, and true things didn't need a witness to remain true. He pulled his gloves back on and picked up where he left off. That evening, when he picked Sophie up from her after-school program, she ran to him at full speed and collided with his side the way she always did, as if proximity to him was the destination and everything else was just the distance to it. He held her for a moment with one arm, and she told him all about a project she was building about butterflies, and he listened to every word. He did not think about Victoria Hale at all, but somewhere across town, in a corner office on the 14th floor of a building with her company's logo on the glass, Victoria Hale was sitting very quietly at her desk, and she was thinking about him. 3 days passed before Victoria Hale thought about Daniel Mercer again, or rather 3 days passed before she allowed herself to acknowledge that she had, in fact, been thinking about him with uncomfortable regularity since the moment she'd driven away from that gravel parking lot. She was a disciplined woman. She had built Hale & Co. Cosmetics from a single product idea she'd had at 23 into a company now valued at $312 million. She did not indulge distractions. She managed her attention the way she managed her portfolio, with precision and purpose and a clear-eyed understanding of what produced returns and what did not. but something about that morning in the garage had lodged in her like a splinter she couldn't locate. She hadn't meant to be cruel. That was the thought that kept surfacing. She had made an observation, hadn't she? An honest, passing observation of the sort that people made all the time. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't been unkind in tone. She had simply, what? Asked a question, offered a perspective. But late at night, when the discipline that carried her through 14-hour days finally loosened its grip, she heard his words again, quiet and precise and utterly without self-pity. She replayed them in the way you replay something that hit a nerve before you understood why. I haven't missed a single day of that in 8 years. Not one. She had been missing days for as long as she could remember. She pushed the thought away and opened her laptop. Victoria's apartment was on the 22nd floor of a glass building downtown, minimal and expensive and aggressively clean. She had lived there for 4 years and had never once arranged the furniture differently from how the interior designer had placed it. She owned a Porsche she rarely drove herself, and a vacation property in Asheville she visited once a year. She had 12 direct reports, a personal assistant named Jess who was worth triple her salary, and a social calendar that was always full and rarely satisfying. She had not spoken to her mother in 6 months. She did not have a daughter. She had not read out loud to anyone since she was a child herself. On Thursday evening, sitting in her office after everyone else had gone home, she found herself typing his name into a search engine. Daniel Mercer. Nashville. Auto repair. Mercer's Auto. Gallatin Pike. The shop had a website that looked like it had been built 10 years ago and never updated. A phone number, a list of services, a few photos of the garage interior, and in one of them, barely in frame, a child's drawing taped to the wall. Crayon. A yellow car and 2 stick figures, one tall, one small. Above them, in uneven letters, me and Daddy. Victoria closed the laptop. She sat in the dark of her office for a long time. On Friday, she did something she could not entirely explain. She told Jess to clear her morning. Not for a meeting, not for a call, just clear it. Jess, who had learned over 4 years not to ask questions about certain instructions, cleared it without comment. Victoria drove herself across town. She had told herself she was going back because the car was making a different sound now, a very slight pull to the right that she'd noticed on the highway yesterday, and that was almost certainly worth having looked at. This was a reasonable and practical explanation. She held on to it firmly. When she pulled into the gravel lot of Mercer's Auto at 9:45, Daniel was in the middle bay, lower half visible beneath a blue pickup truck. He rolled out on the creeper when he heard the Cayenne's engine, looked at the car, then looked at her, and his expression did not betray whatever he might have been thinking. "Ms. Hale," he said, getting to his feet and pulling off his gloves. "Victoria," she said before she could stop herself. Then, more steadily, "There's a pull to the right, on the highway. I noticed it yesterday." He nodded. "Could be the alignment, after we replaced the bearing. Happens sometimes. I should have checked it when you were here, that's on me." He said it simply without self-criticism or self-exoneration, just a fact. You didn't have to say it was on you. It was, though. He tilted his head slightly toward the waiting area. "Give me 40 minutes. She went inside. The coffee maker was on and she poured herself a cup without asking and stood by the window that looked out into the garage. She watched him work for a while. He moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had done something so many times that the steps had become automatic, leaving his attention free for the details that needed it. He didn't rush. He didn't perform. He just worked. After about 15 minutes, his phone rang on the workbench and she saw him glance at the screen and immediately still. Whatever the number was, it made the fluid economy of his movements stop entirely. He picked up the phone and walked to the far side of the bay, out of the sight line of the window, and she heard nothing but could see, from his posture, that whatever the call was about, it was not good. He came back 2 minutes later. His face had the same calm as always, but there was something beneath it now, something that the calm was working harder to contain. He kept working. He didn't explain. When he finished with the car and came inside to write up the invoice, she decided against every instinct she had to ask, "Is everything all right?" He looked up from the clipboard. A long pause. Sophie's teacher called. She got into a conflict at school today. Another kid said something to her. He stopped there and looked back down at the paperwork. What did the other kid say? Another pause. And then quietly, that she didn't have a mom and that's why she was weird. He wrote the final figure on the invoice and set it down on the counter between them without looking up. She's been having a hard week. Victoria was quiet. She thought of a dozen things to say, professional things, managed things, the kinds of words she used in meetings when she needed to acknowledge difficulty and redirect forward. None of them came out. What came out instead was, when I was 9, a girl in my class told me my clothes were wrong. I cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes and then decided I would never let anyone see me cry again. She paused. I've been reasonably successful at that, and it has cost me more than I understood at the time. Daniel looked at her. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. She'll get through it, he said. She's stronger than she knows. She probably got that from somewhere, Victoria said. He said nothing to that, but something in him seemed to receive it. He tore the invoice from the pad and slid it across the counter, and she paid it. And they stood for a moment in a silence that had changed its quality entirely from the silence that had ended her last visit here. For what it's worth, she said, picking up her keys. I'm sorry what I said on Tuesday. It wasn't a question, it was something smaller than that, and I should have known better. He held her gaze. Thank you for saying so. She nodded and turned to go. Victoria. She stopped. He wasn't looking at her, already pulling his gloves back on. Looking at the next vehicle waiting in the bay. Sophie's butterfly project is due Monday. She's been working on it all week. She already told me about 3 species I'd never heard of. A beet. She figures things out. Victoria walked to her car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel before starting it. Outside, through the windshield, she could see the garage bay. Daniel Mercer was back at work, steady, certain, as if the world outside these walls could do whatever it wanted, and he would simply keep at it, because there was a girl at Riverside Elementary who was figuring things out, and he needed to be standing there when she came home. She started the car. She didn't know why her eyes were stinging. She told herself it was the dust. The call came on a Sunday. Victoria was in her apartment when it happened, doing what she did most Sundays, reviewing projections, clearing the email backlog from the week, preparing herself mentally for Monday. She was not someone who rested easily. She was someone who managed the discomfort of stillness by filling it with productivity, which she understood, on a theoretical level, was not the same thing as peace. But understanding something and changing it were different coordinates on a map she had never quite learned to navigate. She was midway through a revenue analysis when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, Nashville area code. Victoria Hale? A man's voice, formal, careful. Yes. This is Sergeant Allen with the Metro Nashville Police. There's been an incident on Highway 65 northbound involving a vehicle registered to your name. A silver Porsche Cayenne. For a moment, the words did not arrange themselves into meaning. Then they did. I don't understand, she said. I'm at home. That car is in my parking garage downstairs. A pause. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come down to the scene. The driver has been identified as a young woman. She has your registration in the car. Everything after that was fast and slow simultaneously, the way time works during events that will later become the events you organize the rest of your life around. She grabbed her jacket, told herself to breathe, called Jess, who didn't pick up. She drove her second car, a sensible BMW she used when she didn't want to think about parking, to the highway, and followed the signs that by then included 2 police vehicles and a cluster of orange cones narrowing traffic to 1 lane. The Cayenne had gone through a guardrail. The front end was deeply compromised. A young woman Victoria had never seen before, maybe 22, was sitting on the back bumper of an ambulance with a foil blanket around her shoulders and a cut across her forehead being attended to by a paramedic. She looked dazed but alive. A separate officer met Victoria at the police tape. His name was Kowalski. He had the exhausted patience of someone who had explained things to shaken people too many times to count. She's not a family member? He asked, looking at the young woman. I've never seen her before in my life. She had your registration and a parking garage keycard. Victoria felt something cold move through her. My parking garage keycard was in the car. I thought I'd lost it weeks ago. Kowalski wrote something down. We'll need to ask you some questions. There may have been unauthorized access to your vehicle. For now, the driver is going to be okay. Concussion. Some lacerations, she got lucky. But we're going to need to understand how she had access. It took 3 hours to get through the questions and the forms and the quiet, careful process of figuring out what had happened. Somewhere in the account, pieces came together. A valet key Victoria had given to a colleague 8 months ago that had apparently not been retrieved. A parking garage with a security gap. A young woman who had made choices that brought her here, to this guardrail on Highway 65, in a car that wasn't hers. By the time Victoria was released and cleared to drive home, it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. She sat in the BMW in the highway rest area and felt something she didn't entirely have a name for. Not just shaken, not just grateful. Something more specific. A strange, hollow awareness of contingency, of how close things run to each other, of how a car she'd been sitting in 3 days ago, that a man with steady hands had made safe, had just gone through a guardrail with someone else inside it. She sat there for a long time. When she finally started driving, she didn't go home. She didn't fully understand why she turned down Gallatin Pike. The shop was closed on Sundays, obviously. She wasn't expecting anything from it. She drove there. She sat in the closed lot for a moment and looked at the dark interior and the rolled-down garage door and the small handwritten sign in the window. Mercer's Auto. Open Mon Free 7 a.m. 5 p.m. Sat 8 a.m. 2 p.m. And then, because she was still holding her phone and her hands were not entirely steady, she did something she would not have predicted herself capable of 2 weeks ago. She looked up the number on the old website and called it. It rang 4 times. She was already composing the sensible thing to do, which was hang up when someone picked up. Hello? Not the professional voice. An off-duty voice. Sunday afternoon. Slightly surprised. Daniel, it's Victoria Hale. A pause. I know this is strange. You don't have to. I just needed to tell someone who would understand why this felt significant, and I couldn't think of anyone else to call. She stopped, mortified by her own honesty. A beat of silence. Are you all right? He said. And the question was not perfunctory. It carried something in it, a careful attention that she felt across the line like a hand steadying something about to fall. She told him what had happened. Not everything, but the shape of it. The highway, the car, the guardrail, the stranger wrapped in a foil blanket. The 3 hours of questions. The drive home that became a different drive. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Sophie's right here, he said, or I'd talk longer. But I'm glad you're not hurt. Victoria. He said her name the way people say names when they mean them. Go home. Eat something. Not something from a delivery app. Something you actually make, even if it's just eggs. The kind of evening you described needs a real meal. She almost laughed. It came out as something slightly adjacent to a laugh. Something that surprised her. Eggs, she repeated. Scrambled, maybe toast. A pause, and she thought she could hear the faint sound of a child's voice somewhere in the background, and the quiet of a Sunday evening in a house where someone small was nearby. Call Jess in the morning. Let her handle the police report details. That's what she's there for. She is very good at that kind of thing. Then let her. She sat with that for a moment. The simple logic of it. Thank you, she said finally. Go home, he said again, gently. Like he meant that too. She drove home. She made eggs, scrambled and toast, because it seemed important. Suddenly, to be someone who did the thing that had been recommended. She ate them at her kitchen counter, looking out at the city lights, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could measure, not the grinding forward momentum of her life, but something else, something quiet, something that felt it. Something, tentatively, like the beginning of paying attention. She did not know yet what she was paying attention to. but she had a feeling she was about to find out. If this story is moving you, hit that like button and leave a comment below. It truly helps this channel grow and lets us keep sharing stories that matter. The Monday after the accident, Victoria arrived at her office 40 minutes earlier than usual, which for her meant 6:20 in the morning, which meant the building was empty except for the overnight security guard and the hum of the HVAC system and the particular quality of silence that only exists before a city fully wakes up. She sat at her desk and looked at her city through floor-to-ceiling glass and thought about eggs. It was not a profound thought. It was a small, ridiculous thought. She had made scrambled eggs at 7:30 on a Sunday night because a mechanic on the phone had told her to, and she had eaten them standing at her kitchen counter looking at Nashville's lights. And something about the simplicity of that act had lodged in her, the way Daniel's words had lodged in her that first Tuesday morning in the garage. Quietly, stubbornly, without permission. She opened her laptop and pulled up the Hale and Cumber third quarter summary, which was excellent. Margins up, new retail partnerships confirmed. The holiday line performing ahead of projection. She read 3 pages and retained almost none of it. By 7:15, Jess arrived, poured herself coffee, and placed a neat stack of folders on the corner of Victoria's desk without comment, which was one of the many things Victoria valued about her. She was about to say good morning when Jess turned from the door and said quite carefully, "The police report from Sunday. I've spoken with their documentation officer. Everything is being handled. The young woman has been cited. Your insurance has been notified." "Thank you," Victoria said. Jess nodded and left. Victoria looked at the folders. Then she looked at the window. Then she picked up her phone and did something she had not done since she was approximately 19 years old. She called her mother. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. She sat with the voicemail tone for a second and then said, "Mom, it's me. I know it's been a while. I wanted to hear your voice. Call me when you get this." She hung up and looked at the phone in her hand the way you look at something after you've done a thing you didn't fully plan to do. She set it face down on the desk and went back to the quarterly summary. At 10 o'clock, Jess appeared again. "You have a call with the Singapore team at 10:30 and lunch with the Beaumont people at noon." A pause. "And there's a delivery at reception. No card." Victoria frowned. "What kind of delivery?" "A plant," Jess said, with the careful neutrality she deployed when she was being politely curious. "A small one, in a clay pot, with a post-it note." Victoria walked to reception. The plant was a small succulent in an uneven clay pot that looked handmade, not artisanally handmade the way things cost extra money for being irregular, but handmade the way things are when someone small makes them, with visible fingerprints pressed into the clay near the base and a glaze that had run slightly on one side, in a way that was entirely charming. The post-it note was in a child's handwriting, large and uneven and earnest, and it said, "Succulents don't need a lot of water. They do good on their own, but they like company." Sophie below that, in a different hand, just 2 words, "Take care." Victoria stood at the reception desk holding the clay pot for longer than was professionally appropriate. The overnight security guard pretended to look at his logbook. Jess found something urgent to do in the direction of the printer. She brought the succulent back to her office and put it on the windowsill where the morning light came in. She did not call the garage to thank him. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be received. She went to her 10:30 call. She was, by all external measures, fully present and professionally sharp. And only she knew that some part of her attention kept drifting to the window, where a small clay pot with fingerprints in it was sitting in the light. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, she drove to the garage. She had told herself she was in the area, which was only partially true. She was in the general quadrant of Nashville that contained Gallatin Pike, which was perhaps a 5-minute detour from her actual route, which was a level of rationalization she would have found embarrassing to examine too closely. Daniel was closing up. It was 4:50 when she pulled in, and the garage door was halfway down, and he stopped rolling it when he saw the car. She got out, and for a moment they stood in the cooling afternoon air, and the light was going golden the way it does in October when it finally decides to commit. "Nothing's wrong with the car," she said. "I know," he said. "I could hear that from here." She almost smiled. The plant is on my windowsill. It gets good light. Sophie will be glad to hear it. He leaned against the half-closed door. She was very specific about the light requirements. She knows her succulents. She looked up 3 varieties before she picked that one, said it needed to be something that could handle neglect but would thrive if you gave it attention. He said it without emphasis. He didn't need emphasis. Victoria felt that land. She was quiet for a moment. How is she, after last week? Better. She gave a presentation about her butterfly project Monday. Her teacher said it was the best in the class. A pause, and something happened in his expression. Not pride, exactly, but something deeper than pride, something that had no clean word for it. She came home and said, "Daddy, I think I understand migration now." That's remarkable for an 8-year-old. She's a remarkable 8-year-old. He said it simply, without bragging, the way you state geography. She has her mother's mind. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sophie's mother. The sentence sat between them in the October air. Victoria did not reach for it, and neither did he. But its presence changed the texture of the quiet. "I called my mother Monday morning," Victoria said after a moment. "For the first time in 6 months. She didn't pick up. I left a voicemail. A beat. She called back Wednesday night. We talked for 40 minutes. He said nothing, but his expression was attentive in the way that matters, not waiting for a pause to speak, but genuinely listening. She's been living alone in Chattanooga for 3 years since my father passed. I knew that. I just kept not calling." She stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "You can stop if you want to," he said. Not unkindly, just factually. "I don't want to," she said, and understood as she said it that this was true. She asked if I was eating properly. I told her I'd made eggs on Sunday. She laughed. She said that was my father's solution to everything, make eggs. Something moved across Daniel's face. Quiet and warm. He sounds like a good man. He was. She looked at the fading sky. I think I've been trying to be him, and couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. He was good without trying. I've been trying very hard and getting something different. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Sometimes the trying is the thing that gets in the way." She looked at him. "Is that what happened with Sophie's mother?" A beat, longer this time. He looked at the middle distance. "No," he said. "With us, it wasn't the trying. It was everything else." He straightened from the door. "She got sick when Sophie was 3 months old. It took her in about 14 months. She fought hard the whole way." He paused. "Her name was Anna." The evening air felt very still. "I'm so sorry," Victoria said. And she meant it in a way that words rarely get to mean things. Simply, directly, without architecture. "Thank you." He reached for the garage door handle. "Sophie has her eyes. Sometimes I'll look up and it'll just..." He stopped and rolled the door down the last 2 feet with a steady, practiced pull. "She's a good reason," he said, which seemed to contain a great deal. Victoria stood in the parking lot as he locked up, and they said a quiet goodbye. And she drove back through the Nashville evening thinking about Anna, who had fought hard the whole way, and left behind 2 dark eyes and a small, remarkable face, and a man who had made of grief something she hadn't known grief could be made into, a life. She stopped at a grocery store on the way home. She bought eggs. November arrived with a cold front and a clarity that felt almost aggressive, the kind of weather that strips things down and makes you see what's actually there. Victoria had not seen Daniel in 11 days when she got the text from a number she'd saved in her phone simply as Mercer's Auto. Daniel, even though she knew by then, and had known for a while, that this was a small dishonesty she was maintaining for reasons that were becoming harder to justify. The text said, "Sophie has a performance Thursday evening. Her class is doing a short program at the community center on Riverside. I know this is strange to send, you don't have to respond. But she asked me to tell you about it, and I don't tell her no when there's no good reason to." Victoria read the text twice. She set the phone down. She picked it up again. She typed, "What time?" He replied, 7. Dress warm. The heat in that building is unreliable. She typed, "I'll be there." She put the phone down and sat with the complicated feeling of having agreed to something she couldn't entirely categorize. It wasn't a date. She understood that clearly and didn't want to muddy it. It was something else. An invitation from a child who had decided, for reasons of her own 8-year-old logic, that Victoria was someone worth inviting. She wasn't sure she'd ever received a more important invitation in her life. Thursday came. She wore a camel coat over a simple dark sweater, boots nothing that would look out of place or overplaced. She drove to the Riverside Community Center and parked in a lot full of minivans and SUVs and family-sized vehicles, and she walked into a lobby decorated with paper turkeys and hand-drawn posters about giving thanks. And she was perhaps the only person there who had not been inside a community center in approximately 15 years. She found Daniel near the back, standing beside 2 folding chairs he'd saved. He was wearing a dark navy jacket over a flannel shirt, and his hair was slightly damp from what she guessed had been a rushed shower between closing the shop and getting here. And there was a small clay smudge on the inside of his left wrist that he'd missed, and something about that detail made her feel an affection so sudden and clear it surprised her. "You came," he said. "Of course I came." She sat down. "How does she know I exist?" "She found the succulent pot after she gave it to you." "She doesn't know how." He sat beside her. "She asked me about you and I told her you were someone I'd met through the shop. She said, and I'm quoting, 'Is she nice or just fancy?' And I said I thought she was becoming the first one." He said it without looking at her. Victoria felt warmth rise in her face. She looked at the low stage at the front of the room where children were filing in from a side door, searching, and then she found Sophie immediately. She would have found her in any crowd, she thought, not because she'd ever seen her in person, but because she knew that face. Dark hair, dark eyes, the quality of attention in her expression that was unmistakably her father's. Sophie was wearing a navy dress and white tights and patent shoes, and she was carrying a paper butterfly on a stick that she held carefully, with great ceremony. She walked to her mark on the stage and stood very straight. She spotted her father in the audience, and her face broke open into a grin that Daniel caught and returned. And for a moment the two of them were in complete private communication across a room full of people. And Victoria watched it happen, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt what it was like to be near something whole. The program lasted 25 minutes. It was about the life cycle of the monarch butterfly. Sophie had a speaking part, 2 sentences about migration that she delivered with an assurance that drew a murmur of appreciation from the parents in the room. When it was over and the children filed back out, Daniel excused himself and went to find her. Victoria stood near the chairs and watched him move through the crowd, the way people greeted him, the warmth they showed, the easy nods of neighbors who knew each other without drama or performance. He was known here. He belonged here in the specific and irreplaceable way that comes only from years of showing up. Sophie appeared at his side and then, almost immediately, looked past him directly at Victoria. Her dark eyes landed and held with an expression of pure, solemn evaluation. Daniel brought her over. "Sophie, this is Victoria." Sophie looked up at her. "Do you like the succulent?" "I love the succulent," Victoria said. "It sits in my window where the morning light comes in, just like you said." Sophie seemed to find this satisfactory. "It'll grow slowly. Daddy says some things that grow slowly are the best ones." Victoria glanced at Daniel. He was looking at Sophie with that expression she'd seen now a handful of times, the one without a clean word for it. "Your father is very smart," Victoria said. "I know," said Sophie, with the serene confidence of someone stating a fact that had long since been settled. They walked out together into the cold night and stood in the parking lot while Sophie described, in considerable detail, a documentary she had watched about monarch butterflies crossing the border, which she called the Butterfly Road, a phrase that Daniel had clearly heard before and still listened to as if it were new. Victoria stood in the cold and breathed in the November air and thought, "This is what I've been missing the shape of." She didn't say that. She said, "The Butterfly Road. That's a beautiful way to put it." Sophie looked up at her. "Are you going to come again?" "Sophie." Daniel said softly. It's okay, Victoria said, and she looked at Daniel when she said it, and something passed between them that was clear and true, and neither one of them looked away from it. She crouched down to Sophie's eye level, which felt natural in a way that surprised her. If your dad says it's okay, I would very much like to come again. Sophie turned to her father. Daddy? He looked at his daughter and then at Victoria, and something shifted in his face. Not the collapse of a wall, but the opening of a door. Very deliberate. Very considered. Something he had decided. Yeah, Bug, he said. I think that would be okay. Sophie turned back to Victoria with the expression of someone who has just finalized a very important arrangement. Good, she said simply, and then she announced she was cold and began moving toward the car at speed. And Daniel followed her, and Victoria stood in the parking lot laughing at something she couldn't fully name. She stood there for a moment in the cold, under the November sky, and felt the thing she'd been circling for weeks finally arrive and settle. She did not feel afraid of it. That was the revelation. She drove home with the heat on and the radio off, and the quiet felt entirely different from the quiet she'd been carrying for years. Not empty, not managed, full. She was almost at her building when her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at it at a red light. A text from Daniel. She made me promise to ask if you're free Saturday. There's a farmer's market. She has a whole plan. You can say no. Victoria smiled at her phone in the red light glow of a Nashville November night and typed, Tell her yes. Then, after a breath, Tell her I'll bring coffee. She set the phone down. The light turned green. She drove home through the city that suddenly, without having moved a single building, looked entirely different. Something was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. In the pressure, in the stillness, in the particular quality of the air that tells you the world is about to show you something it's been keeping. She didn't know yet what it was. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not trying to get ahead of it. She was simply waiting. And that, she understood, was everything. The Saturday farmer's market on the east side of Nashville smelled like apple cider and roasted pecans and wood smoke from a barrel grill someone had set up near the entrance. And Sophie Mercer moved through it like a general who had been planning this campaign for days. She had a list. An actual handwritten list, which Victoria saw tucked in the front pocket of her corduroy jacket. She referenced it periodically with great seriousness, crossing items off with a stubby pencil she kept behind her ear. And Daniel walked slightly behind her with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who had long since accepted that he was support staff on these excursions and was entirely at peace with this. Victoria had brought coffee, 3 cups from a cafe she liked, though she'd gotten Sophie a hot chocolate, which Sophie had examined with approval and declared very professional. They moved through the market in the clean, cold morning, and Victoria fell into step beside Daniel while Sophie navigated ahead, and they talked. Not about anything large. About the vendors, about the pecan farmer who apparently had an ongoing rivalry with Daniel over the correct way to store whole pecans. About a book Sophie had read twice already about a girl who became a botanist. About how Daniel had taught himself to bake bread during the first winter after Anna died, because he needed something that required his full attention for a set amount of time and produced a result he could hold. Do you still make it? Victoria asked. Every weekend. Sophie says the crust has to be loud when you knock it or it doesn't count. The crust has to be loud, Victoria repeated. Loud means it's done properly. She looked at him. You've built a whole life with very specific standards. She built them, he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who understood exactly where the credit belonged. I just kept up. At a small stall near the end of the market, Sophie stopped in front of a display of hand-thrown pottery, bowls, cups, small vessels in earthy glazes, and stood looking at them with an intensity that made the vendor, a woman about 60 with paint-stained fingers, put down what she was doing and give Sophie her full attention. How do you make the color do that? Sophie asked, pointing to a bowl with a glaze that shifted from deep rust to pale amber near the rim. The woman leaned on the table and explained, in genuine and unhurried detail, about iron oxide and temperature, and how the kiln's atmosphere during the final firing changed everything about what color the piece became. Sophie listened with her whole body, the way children do when something is igniting a real connection in their mind. She asked 3 follow-up questions, each more specific than the last. Victoria watched this and felt something move through her with great force. This was what she had built a company to achieve, a place where things were made with skill and care and knowledge. And here was an 8-year-old girl at a Saturday market absorbing that same understanding with the same seriousness. And it was more impressive. Daniel was watching too. He caught Victoria's eye and something passed between them in the morning light, an understanding, full and wordless, about what they were both witnessing. The woman at the stall ended up giving Sophie a small, irregular bowl. A test piece. It came out of the kiln differently than I planned, which is its own kind of lesson, and Sophie accepted it with a gravity that made the woman laugh with genuine delight. They found a bench near a fire drum and sat together, Sophie in the middle, her hands curled around her hot chocolate, the little bowl in her lap. She was telling them about a documentary she wanted to watch about glass blowing. Daniel was asking questions and Victoria was doing the same, and it struck her somewhere in the middle of this ordinary Saturday morning that she had sat in this city for years, in rooms full of important people at important tables, and had rarely felt as present as she did right now on a cold bench, with coffee going cool in her cup and a child explaining glass-blowing between them. "Victoria," Sophie said, with the particular directness that 8-year-olds reserve for questions they've been holding for a while. "Do you have kids?" Daniel said. "Sophie." "It's okay," Victoria said. She looked at Sophie's serious, waiting face. "No, I don't." Sophie considered this. "Do you want them?" "Sophie?" Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "It's an honest question," Sophie said, not defensive, just factual. Victoria looked at the child beside her and thought about the version of herself that had walked into a garage 3 weeks ago and made a careless joke about a man's life. And she thought about the version of herself who had stood in an empty parking lot in the cold and felt something finally arrive. And she thought about a plant on a windowsill and a phone call to her mother and eggs on a Sunday night and the sound of a child presenting butterfly migration to a room full of parents. "I think," she said slowly, "that I used to not know how to want things properly. I wanted achievements instead of people. It felt safer." She looked at her coffee cup. "But something has been changing recently. Something I didn't plan." Sophie absorbed this with the seriousness it had been offered. Then she said, "Daddy says that sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying to be in charge of everything." Victoria looked at Daniel. He was looking at his daughter with that expression she'd come to know as the most honest thing she'd ever seen on a human face. Then he looked at Victoria, and it was the same expression, and her breath did something complicated. "She quotes me more accurately than I deserve," he said quietly. "She quotes you exactly right," Victoria said. They sat there for another hour, the 3 of them, while the market moved around them and the morning light shifted and Sophie finished her hot chocolate and started a careful inspection of everything in her little pottery bowl, as if it might contain a universe. Which Victoria thought it kind of did. At some point, Sophie fell slightly asleep against Victoria's side, the sudden, total surrender of a child who has used up her energy and doesn't negotiate with biology. And Victoria sat very still, afraid to move and break it. And Daniel looked over and said nothing for a long time. Just sat with her in the particular silence of that. Then he said very quietly, "Anna would have liked you." Victoria felt tears arrive before she could do anything about the years of practice at not allowing them. "I think I would have liked her too," she said. Her voice was even, barely. "She was direct," he said. "She didn't like wasted words. She made the best coffee I've ever had and she never once told me the recipe." A beat. Sophie has the same face, same intensity, same thing in the eyes when she's figured something out. He paused. "She's going to be extraordinary." "She already is," Victoria said. "I know." He looked at his sleeping daughter and then at the sky and then at Victoria. "I've been alone with that for a long time, knowing it. It's different saying it to someone. You can say it to me, Victoria said. Whenever. He looked at her. I know that now. The morning passed. Sophie woke up and declared she needed a cheese sample from the dairy stall she'd overlooked earlier. Daniel went with her. Victoria sat on the bench alone for a moment and looked at the blue November sky and felt the shape of what was happening with a clarity that required no interpretation. She was happy. Not the managed satisfaction of a good quarter or a successful launch. Not the controlled calm of a long day handled well. Something different. Something that came from outside her own effort and landed in her like light lands in a room when you finally open the curtains you've kept drawn for years. When they came back, Sophie with 2 samples and a very strong opinion about aged Gouda, they walked to the parking lot together and stood in the familiar pattern of a goodbye that nobody was in a hurry to finish. Sophie hugged Victoria without preamble, just walked up and put her arms around her waist and held on for a moment, and Victoria held her back. And it was very simple, and it was the most significant thing that had happened in a long time. When Sophie ran ahead to the truck, Daniel turned to Victoria and they stood in the morning light and he said, "Thank you for coming. Thank you for telling me to." A pause. "She likes you. I like her." Victoria looked at him. "I like you too, Daniel. I want to be straightforward about that, because I've spent a lot of years not being straightforward about important things and I'm trying to change that." He looked at her for a long moment. And then slowly, the settled calm of his face opened into something else. Not the careful steadiness he carried through the world, but something more exposed, more true, something that had been there for a while and was only now being allowed into the light. "I'd like that," he said simply. "If we take it at Sophie's pace." "Sophie's pace," Victoria agreed immediately. "Absolutely." He smiled. It was not a large smile, but it was entirely real, and it reached all the way to his eyes, and Victoria thought that she could live a very long time and probably not see anything more worth seeing than that. He walked to the truck. Sophie had already rolled down the window and was waving with both hands, theatrical and joyful, and Victoria waved back. She stood in the parking lot as they drove away, and the cold air was clean, and the light was good, and the city was going about its Saturday with complete indifference to the fact that something had been quietly, irrevocably repaired in the world. 2 lives that had gone silent in different ways, for different reasons, had found something in a gravel parking lot on Gallatin Pike. Something that started with a cruel joke and a quiet answer, and became, through patience and honesty, and a small girl with dark eyes and a list in her pocket, something neither of them had known they were still capable of. Victoria drove home. She didn't make eggs this time. She called her mother instead, and they talked for an hour, and at some point her mother said, "You sound different, Vicky. You sound like yourself again." Victoria sat on her couch with the phone to her ear and looked at the succulent on the windowsill. Light falling across the clay pot with the fingerprints in it, and she thought, yes, that's exactly what this is. Herself again.